History has a way of illuminating the grand figures while casting shadows over those who stood quietly in the background. We remember the names that echo through centuries, the kings, the prophets, the apostles, who preached to thousands. But tonight, we turn our attention to the forgotten faithful, the unnamed companions, the quiet believers who shaped the greatest story ever told without ever seeking recognition. In the dusty roads of first-century Palestine, countless lives intersected with the ministry of Jesus of Nazareth, some for mere moments, others for months or years. Yet their stories, though often reduced to single verses or passing mentions, reveal the profound humanity behind the gospel accounts. These were real people with real fears, real hopes, and real faith that sometimes whispered when others shouted. So before we begin our journey into these hidden lives, feel free to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy these quiet explorations of faith and history. And let me know in the comments which of these forgotten figures speaks to your heart. It's always wonderful to see how these ancient stories still touch us today. Now, let's find a quiet space together and step back 2,000 years to walk alongside those who chose to follow, to serve, and to believe, even when the world wasn't watching. Verse 1. Daily life immersion, the women who traveled. Picture, if you will, the moment just before dawn in ancient Galilee. The air is crisp, carrying the scent of olive groves and the distant tang of the Sea of Galilee. In a modest dwelling on the outskirts of Magdala, a woman named Mary rises before the sun touches the horizon. Her movements are practiced, efficient. She has done this countless mornings before. But Mary Magdalene is not alone in these early hours. Across the region, other women are stirring to life with the same quiet purpose. In Bethany, another Mary sister to Martha and Lazarus is already preparing provisions for the day ahead. Near Capernaum, Joanna, wife of Chuza, who serves in Herod's household, is carefully folding coins into a small leather pouch, her contribution to the common fund that sustains the traveling ministry. These were the women who traveled with Jesus, and Luke tells us their names with careful reverence. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out, and Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager, and Susanna, and many others, who provided for them out of their means. But what did it mean, practically speaking, for these women to follow an itinerant rabbi across the Palestinian countryside? How did they live? What sacrifices did they make that history barely recorded? To understand their lives, we must first understand the radical nature of their choice. In first-century Jewish society, respectable women typically remained within the bounds of their households. Their primary roles centered on family and domestic duties. Yet here were women, some married, some with independent means, some who had been healed and transformed, choosing to leave behind societal expectations to support a ministry that would change the world. Consider Joanna, wife of Chuza. Her husband managed the household affairs of Herod Antipas, the Tetrarch of Galilee. She lived in relative comfort, with access to resources and social standing. Yet something about Jesus' teaching compelled her to risk that security. Can you imagine the conversations in her household? The raised eyebrows among her social circle? The whispered concerns about a woman of her station following a controversial teacher from Nazareth? Their daily routine would have been governed by the rhythm of Jesus' ministry. When he taught by the lakeside, they listened from the edges of the crowd, perhaps helping to manage the logistics that the Gospels never detail. Who ensured there was bread when Jesus multiplied the loaves? Who carried the extra cloaks when the evening grew cold? Who tended to the sick who came seeking healing, offering comfort while miracles unfolded? The women provided for the ministry out of their means. The Greek word here suggests not just financial support, but practical sustenance. They were, in essence, the invisible infrastructure that made the public ministry possible. While Peter and John and James received the direct teachings, these women ensured there was food for the meal, lodging for the night, and resources for the journey ahead. Mary Magdalene's story is perhaps the most compelling of all. Described as one from whom 7 demons had gone out, she represents the profound transformation that characterized many who joined Jesus' inner circle. Whatever her past struggles, whether physical ailment, mental anguish, or spiritual torment, she had been restored, and her gratitude expressed itself in unwavering devotion. Imagine her perspective on those long walks between villages. Having experienced darkness, she would have understood the light in Jesus' words with particular clarity. When others might have grown weary of the constant travel, the uncertain accommodations, the suspicious glances from townspeople, Mary Magdalene would have remembered what life was like before this hope entered her world. The women's presence also speaks to the inclusive nature of Jesus' ministry in ways that are easy to overlook. In a culture where women's testimony was not accepted in legal proceedings, where they were often relegated to separate spheres, Jesus welcomed them as full participants in his mission. They were not merely supporters from a distance, but companions on the journey. As we follow these women through their days rising early to prepare for travel, walking the dusty roads under the Palestinian sun, finding lodging in unfamiliar towns, listening to parables that would echo through eternity, we begin to understand the depth of their commitment. They were not seeking glory or recognition. They were not positioning themselves for positions of authority in the coming kingdom. They were simply present, faithfully, consistently present. And in that presence, in that quiet service, in that willingness to follow without fully understanding where the path would lead, they became integral to the greatest story ever told. When the male disciples fled at the crucifixion, it was these women who remained. When the tomb was discovered empty, it was to these faithful companions that the resurrection was first revealed. Their names, Mary, Joanna, Susanna, and the many others whose names we'll never know, remind us that God's work is often accomplished through those who serve in the shadows, who give without seeking credit, who believe without demanding proof. In the gentle rhythm of their faithful presence, we hear an echo of devotion that transcends the centuries, whispering to us still about the profound impact of quiet, consistent faith. Verse 2. Biography, event narrative. Simon of Cyrene. One man's interrupted journey from the quiet faithfulness of those who chose to follow. We turn now to a man who never chose his moment of connection with the gospel story. His name was Simon, and he was from Cyrene, a Greek city on the North African coast in what is now Libya. On what began as an ordinary morning in Jerusalem, Simon would find himself thrust into the center of history's most pivotal moment. The year was likely 30 or 33 AD. The city of Jerusalem was swelling with Passover pilgrims, and Simon was among them. Perhaps he had saved for years to make this journey, as many Jews in the diaspora did. Cyrene had a substantial Jewish population refugees and their descendants from centuries of displacement and voluntary migration. For Simon, this pilgrimage to the holy city would have represented a profound spiritual homecoming. Picture Simon that morning, walking through the narrow streets of Jerusalem with the anticipation that comes from approaching the temple after a long journey. He might have been thinking of the sacrifices he would offer, the prayers he would pray, the stories he would tell when he returned home to Cyrene. The city was alive with the controlled chaos of the festival bleating sheep being led to sacrifice, the aroma of roasting lamb mixing with incense, conversations in a dozen languages as pilgrims from across the Roman world converged on the holy city. But as Simon made his way through the streets, he encountered something that would change his life forever. A procession was approaching, not the celebratory kind that marked religious festivals, but the grim parade of Roman justice. 3 condemned men were being led to execution, each carrying the horizontal beam of his cross to the place called Golgotha. The Gospels tell us what happened next with striking brevity. Matthew writes, "As they went out, they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name. They compelled him to carry his cross." Mark adds the detail that Simon was the father of Alexander and Rufus, suggesting these sons were known to the early Christian community. Luke simply states, "And as they led him away, they seized one Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, and laid on him the cross to carry it behind Jesus." But within those few words lies a profound transformation. Simon was compelled. The Greek word here is the same used for the Roman military practice of impressment, where soldiers could force civilians to carry their equipment for a mile. This was not a request. It was a command backed by the authority of Rome. Try to imagine Simon's bewilderment. One moment he was a pilgrim approaching the temple, his mind filled with worship and devotion. The next, he was pressed into service as an unwilling participant in an execution. The rough wood of the crossbeam suddenly across his shoulders, the weight of it biting into his back, the jeers of the crowd now directed not just at the condemned men, but at him as well. Who was this man he was being forced to help? As they walked that terrible path to Golgotha, Simon would have learned that this was Jesus of Nazareth, the teacher who had caused such controversy in the city. Perhaps Simon had heard whispers about him in the pilgrim camps outside the city walls. Perhaps he had even been in the temple courts when Jesus overturned the money changers' tables just days before. The walk to Golgotha was not long, perhaps half a mile, through the winding streets of Jerusalem. But for Simon, it must have felt like an eternity. With each step, he was moving further from his carefully planned pilgrimage and deeper into a drama he never sought to join. The weight of the cross was nothing compared to the weight of confusion, fear, and perhaps growing awe at the man walking ahead of him. What did Simon see in Jesus during those moments? The Gospels focus on Jesus' words to the daughters of Jerusalem who wept for him, but they also tell us that Jesus had been scourged, that he was weakened by the brutality of Roman punishment. Yet something in his bearing, something in the way he carried himself even in his suffering, must have struck Simon profoundly. When they reached Golgotha, Simon's forced participation in the crucifixion ended. The soldiers took the cross from him, and he was free to go. But the evidence suggests he didn't simply walk away. Mark's Gospel mentions that Simon was the father of Alexander and Rufus, a detail that would only matter if these sons were known to the early Christian community. In Romans 16:13, Paul sends greetings to Rufus, chosen in the Lord, and his mother, who has been a mother to me as well. This suggests that Simon's encounter with Jesus on the road to Golgotha was transformative, not just for that moment, but for the rest of his life. The man who was compelled to carry the cross became one who chose to carry the message. His sons became members of the early church, and his wife became like a mother to the Apostle Paul. Consider the profound irony of Simon's story. He came to Jerusalem as a pilgrim seeking God, but he found God in the most unexpected place, in the suffering servant walking ahead of him to Golgotha. He was forced into service, but that forced service became the doorway to a faith that would shape his family for generations. Simon's story reminds us that sometimes our most significant encounters with the divine come not when we're seeking them, but when we're simply trying to live our ordinary lives. He was a man from North Africa, a Jew of the diaspora, someone who would have been considered peripheral to the events unfolding in Jerusalem. Yet God chose him to play a crucial role in the crucifixion narrative. In the end, Simon of Cyrene teaches us that no encounter with Jesus, however brief or seemingly accidental, is without consequence. The cross he carried for a few hundred yards became the symbol of a faith that would carry his family and eventually the world for centuries to come. His interrupted journey to the temple became a different kind of pilgrimage entirely, one that led not to ritual sacrifice, but to the sacrifice that would end all sacrifices. From the dusty streets of Jerusalem to the communities of the early church, Simon's story echoes with the truth that God's purposes often unfold through the most unexpected servants, in the most unexpected moments, in the most unexpected ways. Verse 3, Mystery, Culture, Tech, Roman Crucifixion Protocols, the hidden machinery of execution. From the personal story of one man's transformed life We must now turn to examine the brutal system that brought Simon and Jesus together on that road to Golgotha. To understand the full weight of what Simon carried, we need to explore the dark efficiency of Roman crucifixion, not merely as an act of violence, but as a carefully orchestrated system of terror designed to maintain imperial control. The Romans did not invent crucifixion, but they perfected it. What began as a method of execution among the Persians and Carthaginians became, in Roman hands, something far more calculated and cruel. It was not simply about ending life. It was about ending life as publicly and agonizingly as possible, creating a spectacle that would burn itself into the memory of anyone who might consider challenging Roman authority. The process began long before the condemned reached the place of execution. Roman crucifixion was governed by protocols as precise as any military operation. The sentence would be pronounced by a Roman magistrate, and from that moment, a series of procedures would unfold with methodical precision. First came the scourging, a punishment so severe that many did not survive it. The flagrum, a whip embedded with bone fragments, metal, and pottery shards, was designed to tear flesh from bone. Roman law actually limited the number of lashes a Roman citizen could receive, but for non-citizens, there was no such protection. The scourging was not just punishment. It was the first stage of a process designed to weaken the condemned, so that death would come more swiftly once they were placed on the cross. Then came the procession itself, and here we encounter the detail that would intersect with Simon's life. The condemned were required to carry the patibulum, the horizontal crossbeam, through the streets to the place of execution. This serving multiple purposes. It was another form of humiliation. It conserved the strength of the Roman soldiers, and it served as a moving advertisement of Roman justice. But why did Jesus need help carrying his cross when the other two condemned men apparently did not? The answer lies in the calculated brutality of his scourging. Pontius Pilate, hoping to satisfy the crowd's bloodlust without actually executing Jesus, had ordered him to be flogged. But the plan backfired. The severity of the punishment left Jesus so weakened that he could not complete the required carrying of his cross. The mechanics of crucifixion itself reveal the cold engineering of suffering. Archaeological evidence from the 1st century, including the discovery of crucified remains near Jerusalem, has taught us much about Roman methods. The vertical post, or stipes, was often a permanent fixture at execution sites. The condemned would carry only the horizontal beam, which would then be affixed to create the familiar cross shape. The nails were driven not through the palms, as often depicted in art, but through the wrists, between the radius and ulna bones. This was discovered when archaeologists found the remains of a crucified man named Yehohanan in an ossuary near Jerusalem. A nail was still embedded in his heel bone, and the positioning of the remains revealed that his arms had been nailed at the wrists, not the palms, which would not have supported the body's weight. The locations for crucifixion were chosen deliberately. They were always public, often along major roads where the maximum number of people would witness the executions. Golgotha, the place of the skull, was located outside Jerusalem's walls, but near a major thoroughfare. This wasn't accidental, it was strategic. Every person entering or leaving the holy city would see the consequences of challenging Roman rule. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Roman crucifixion was its calculated efficiency in creating maximum psychological impact with minimum resources. A small squad of soldiers could manage multiple executions simultaneously. The condemned provided their own instrument of death by carrying the crossbeam. The crosses could be reused by simply replacing the horizontal beam. Even the nails were often retrieved and reused, as iron was valuable. The Romans understood that the power of crucifixion lay not just in the death it brought, but in the terror it inspired. Crucified victims could hang for days, exposed to the elements, to birds of prey, to the mocking of passers-by. It was a death that stripped away every shred of human dignity, designed to make the condemned an object of revulsion rather than sympathy. This is why the gospel accounts are so remarkable in their restraint. Where Roman historians would describe crucifixion in clinical detail, the gospel writers focus on the human drama, the spiritual significance, the words spoken rather than the mechanics of suffering. They understood that the method of Jesus' death was not the point, the meaning was. Yet understanding these protocols helps us appreciate the profound courage of those who remained near the cross. When the Gospels tell us that Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, saw where he was laid, they're describing women who chose to witness the full horror of Roman justice. When they tell us about the centurion's declaration that surely this was the Son of God, they're describing a professional executioner who had overseen countless crucifixions, but recognized something unprecedented in this one. The system was designed to dehumanize both the condemned and the witnesses. But in the case of Jesus' crucifixion, the opposite occurred. Instead of inspiring terror and submission, it inspired faith and transformation. Instead of demonstrating Roman power, it revealed divine love. Instead of silencing a message, it amplified it across the centuries. Simon of Cyrene's forced participation in this system makes his story even more remarkable. He was pressed into service by a machinery of death that had been refined over centuries. Yet his brief involvement became a doorway to life. The cross he carried was an instrument of the empire's most brutal punishment, yet it became the symbol of the world's greatest hope. In the clinical precision of Roman crucifixion protocols, we see the lengths to which human systems will go to maintain control through fear. But in the story of those who encountered Christ, within that system Simon who carried the cross, the women who watched, the centurion who declared, the thief who believed, we see something far more powerful than imperial might. We see the quiet triumph of love over fear, of hope over despair, of life over death, accomplished not through superior force, but through willing sacrifice, not through the machinery of empire, but through the mystery of grace. Verse 4. Contrasting perspective. Nicodemus by night. Faith that whispered instead of shouted. As we near the end of our journey through these hidden lives, we encounter perhaps the most complex figure of all, a man whose faith developed not in the bright light of public declaration, but in the shadows of private seeking. His name was Nicodemus, and his story reminds us that sometimes the most profound transformations happen not with dramatic flourishes, but with quiet, persistent questions asked in the darkness. Nicodemus was a Pharisee, a member of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council. In the social hierarchy of first-century Palestine, he occupied one of the highest positions possible for a Jewish man under Roman occupation. He was learned, respected, influential. His opinions carried weight in the temple courts. His voice was heard in the councils that shaped Jewish religious life. By every measure his society valued, Nicodemus had arrived. Yet something about Jesus of Nazareth disturbed his certainty. The signs, the teachings, the way this carpenter's son spoke with authority that seemed to bypass all the proper channels of religious education. It demanded investigation. But for a man of Nicodemus's position, such investigation carried enormous risks. So he came by night. John's Gospel records their encounter with careful attention to detail. Now there was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a ruler of the Jews. This man came to Jesus by night and said to him, "Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God, for no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him." The phrase "by night" appears 3 times in John's Gospel in connection with Nicodemus, and each time it carries layers of meaning. Practically, it speaks to the political necessity of secrecy. A member of the Sanhedrin seen consulting with Jesus would have faced immediate scrutiny, possible censure, perhaps even expulsion from the council. The darkness provided cover for a conversation that could not safely happen in daylight. But symbolically, the night represents something deeper, the twilight realm, where faith and doubt wrestle, where old certainties encounter new possibilities. where the established order meets the revolutionary word. Listen to how Nicodemus approaches Jesus. "Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God." Notice the careful diplomacy in his words. He doesn't come with accusations or challenges, but with a kind of cautious respect. He uses the honorific title, Rabbi, acknowledging Jesus' teaching authority. He speaks in the plural, we know, perhaps indicating that he's not the only member of the religious establishment who has been quietly observing Jesus with interest. But Jesus cuts through the diplomatic niceties with words that must have shaken Nicodemus to his core. "Truly, truly, I say to you, unless one is born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God." Born again. The Greek word anothen can mean both again and from above. This double meaning would not have been lost on Nicodemus, a man steeped in the subtleties of theological language. Jesus was speaking about transformation so radical that it required nothing less than a complete restart. A new birth that came not from human effort, but from divine initiative. Nicodemus's response reveals both his intellectual honesty and his struggle to comprehend. How can a man be born when he is old? Can he enter a second time into his mother's womb and be born? For a man who had spent his life mastering the intricacies of Jewish law, who had earned his position through years of study and careful observance, the suggestion that all of this might need to be set aside for something entirely new was almost incomprehensible. But here's what makes Nicodemus' story so compelling. He didn't walk away. Even when Jesus spoke of the Spirit moving like wind, you hear its sound, but you do not know where it comes from or where it goes. Nicodemus remained engaged. Even when Jesus challenged his understanding of fundamental spiritual truths, Nicodemus continued to question, to probe, to seek understanding. The conversation that night planted seeds that would grow slowly, quietly, in the darkness of Nicodemus's heart. Unlike the dramatic conversions of some other figures in the Gospels, Nicodemus's transformation was gradual, almost imperceptible. He was not struck blind on the road to Damascus, nor did he immediately leave his nets to follow. Instead, he returned to his life in the Sanhedrin, carrying with him questions that had no easy answers. The next time we encounter Nicodemus in John's Gospel, he's in the Sanhedrin as they debate what to do about Jesus. The chief priests and Pharisees are complaining, "Why did you not bring him?" When the temple guards return empty-handed from an attempt to arrest Jesus. In this heated environment, Nicodemus speaks up not with a bold declaration of faith, but with a careful legal argument. Does our law judge a man without first giving him a hearing and learning what he does? It's a quietly courageous moment. Nicodemus doesn't defend Jesus directly, but he defends the principle of due process. He uses his legal expertise to create space for Jesus to continue his ministry. His colleague's response is telling. "Are you from Galilee too? Search and see that no prophet arises from Galilee." They're suspicious, but Nicodemus has been careful enough in his words that they can't accuse him of outright sympathizing with Jesus. This is faith operating under constraint, belief expressing itself through the channels available to it. Nicodemus couldn't stand up in the Sanhedrin and declare Jesus as Messiah. Such a declaration would have ended his influence immediately. Instead, he worked within the system, using his position to create whatever protection he could for the man who had challenged everything he thought he knew about God. The final appearance of Nicodemus in John's Gospel is perhaps the most revealing of all. It comes after the crucifixion, when Jesus has been taken down from the cross and needs to be buried. Joseph of Arimathea, another secret disciple, has asked Pilate for the body. But he doesn't work alone. Nicodemus also, who earlier had come to Jesus by night, came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds. 75 pounds of burial spices. This was not a modest gesture. It was the kind of honor typically reserved for royalty. Nicodemus had finally found a way to make his declaration of faith, but it came at the moment when such a declaration seemed most futile. The disciples had fled, the crowds had dispersed, the authorities had won. Yet here was Nicodemus, no longer hiding in the darkness, publicly associating himself with the crucified Jesus. In this final act, we see the full arc of Nicodemus's transformation. The man who once came by night to ask questions was now working in broad daylight to honor the dead. The Pharisee, who had to speak carefully in the Sanhedrin, was now openly identifying himself with the executed rabbi. The seeker who had struggled to understand spiritual rebirth was now participating in the ritual preparation of the body that would soon experience ultimate rebirth. Nicodemus represents a different kind of discipleship, not the dramatic leave everything behind following of the 12, but the slow, careful, persistent seeking of someone who had much to lose and little to gain by believing. His faith whispered instead of shouted, but it was no less real for its quietness. In our age of public declarations and social media testimonies, Nicodemus reminds us that not all authentic faith is loud. Some of the most profound transformations happen in the private spaces of the heart, in the quiet wrestling with questions that have no easy answers, in the gradual recognition that what we thought we knew about God might need to be completely reconsidered. His story also reminds us that God honors seeking, even when that seeking is tentative, even when it's constrained by circumstances, even when it can only happen under cover of darkness. The man who came by night to ask questions eventually found the courage to stand in the light, to spend lavishly on burial spices, to risk everything for the faith that had been quietly growing in his heart. From the women who traveled with Jesus to Simon, who carried his cross, from the brutal efficiency of Roman crucifixion to the quiet courage of Nicodemus, we see that the gospel story is rich with hidden figures whose faith shaped history in ways both dramatic and subtle. Some believed immediately, others gradually. Some served publicly, others privately. Some shouted their faith from the rooftops, others whispered it in the darkness. But all of them remind us that God's story is not just about the famous names and dramatic moments. It's also about the quiet faithful, the reluctant servants, the gradual seekers, the anonymous supporters who made the public ministry possible. It's about ordinary people whose encounters with the extraordinary changed not just their own lives, but the course of history itself. Conclusion. As we reach the end of our journey through these hidden lives, we're left with a profound truth. The gospel story is not just about the famous figures whose names we know, but about the countless unnamed and overlooked people whose quiet faith shaped history. In the women who traveled with Jesus, we see the power of faithful presence. In Simon of Cyrene, we see how God can transform an unwilling participant into a committed believer. In the protocols of Roman crucifixion, we see how the machinery of death became the instrument of life. And in Nicodemus, we see that faith can grow slowly, quietly, persistently, even in the most unlikely hearts. These stories remind us that we don't need to be famous to be significant. We don't need to be perfect to be used, and we don't need to understand everything to believe. Sometimes the most profound impact comes from simply being present, from carrying what we're asked to carry, from asking the questions that matter, from offering what we have to give. Perhaps you see yourself in one of these hidden figures tonight. Perhaps you're like the women who traveled with Jesus, faithfully supporting God's work in quiet ways. Perhaps you're like Simon, unexpectedly called to carry something heavier than you ever imagined. Perhaps you're like Nicodemus, wrestling with questions in the darkness, trying to reconcile what you've always believed with what you're beginning to see. Wherever you find yourself in this story, know that your part matters. Your faith, whether it whispers or shouts, whether it's brand new or carefully cultivated over decades, whether it's confident or questioning, it has a place in the continuing story of God's work in the world. Thank you for joining me on this quiet exploration of faith and history. If these stories have spoken to you, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. And as always, feel free to subscribe for more gentle journeys through the remarkable stories that shaped our world. Until next time, may you find grace in the hidden moments, courage in the quiet callings, and hope in the knowledge that every faithful step no matter how small, echoes through eternity.